Tonight, we step into a stone chamber, lit by quiet flames, the air heavy with incense and secrets. A girl in armour listens, not to men, but to voices born of bells and wind. By dawn, the same hands that blessed her banner prepare the wood. The voices came like soft bells in mist, clear and steady, calling her by name. No preface, no court, no lesson, only a task. Go to the heart of war and turn the tide. She moved as if led by a thread of light, a farmer's daughter, a standard in her hand, faith in her chest like a small fierce Sunday. France burned, towns were ash, men in robes and men in mail weighed power like coin. She asked for armour, a horse and a chance. She spoke of saints as if they were neighbours. She made commanders listen. She lifted sieges. She raised hope. But victory wakes fear, and fear wakes politics. The same church that taught her to love the holy grew afraid of the holy in her. This is not a tale of saints carved in gold. It is a tale of rooms without windows, of quills scratching judgments, of voices cross-examined by men who never heard them. It is a story of how a living faith can threaten a dead order, how power hides behind doctrine, and how a trial can be built like a scaffold, beam by beam, word by word. We will walk beside Joan from the first whisper to the final smoke. We will hear what she heard, as far as words allow. We will enter council chambers where faith turns into policy. We will watch a tribunal dress fear in Latin and call it law. We will see how betrayal can wear a mitre, how silence can sound like prayer, and how a single conscience can outshine a hall of candles. Not to rage, to see, to understand the narrow bridge between devotion and danger, and to ask, with clear eyes, who did the burning and why. The field was quiet, except for the soft hum of insects and the steady rhythm of her own breath. Joan bent to pull a weed from the soil, the dirt cool and damp in her hand. The sun had not yet reached its height, and the world still held a softness that belonged to morning. Her sheep grazed nearby, the bells around their necks ringing with the slow patience of creatures who knew nothing of war or kings. She was a girl of earth and rhythm, bound by seasons, work, and prayer. Yet in that stillness, something entered that was not of earth. It came not with thunder, nor with the fear of sudden sound. It came like a bell at a distance, its tone pure, rising above the silence, until silence itself seemed to listen. She froze. The air felt denser, as though she had stepped into a space set apart. Then a voice, not her father's, not her mother's, not any villager's, spoke her name, clear, unshaken, more real than the soil beneath her fingers. Her breath caught in her chest. She looked around, half expecting to find someone on the road, but there was no one. The sheep grazed without notice. The sky remained wide and unchanged. Only she had heard. The voice spoke again, gentle yet commanding. It told her to live with purity, to keep her heart unbroken by sin, to attend church. These words did not surprise her. She had been raised in faith, accustomed to prayer, the ringing of bells, the murmured rosary beads at night. But then, like a flame-catching straw, came the task that broke her understanding. She would be called to lead, to drive the English from her land, to bring the Dauphin to Reims for his coronation. The girl of fields and sheep felt her knees weaken. She was no knight, she was no priest, she was no one of consequence. Yet the voice spoke as if it had chosen her, and no other. She knelt in the dirt, her hands trembling. A flood of fear came first, the small, ordinary fear of being mistaken or mad. But beneath that fear was a calmness that was older than her, a calmness that said, "This is not yours to choose, this is already chosen." She stayed there, kneeling, until the sun rose higher and the sheep wandered further. Only then did she rise, dust on her hands, and carry this secret inside her chest like a hidden ember. The voice did not leave her. It would come again and again, at times when she least expected it, always steady, always firm. A farmer's daughter, born to carry water and tend sheep, was being called into a story that would shake kings and unsettle priests. That evening, she returned home and ate in silence. Her family spoke of neighbours, of harvest, of taxes. She nodded, answered when asked, but her mind was elsewhere. She lay down on her straw bed and closed her eyes, but the voice remained in her ear, as if carved into her bones. It was not a dream, it was not imagination, it was a call, and she had answered, though she had not yet said a word. The second time came by the church, near the stone archway where shadows lingered in afternoon light. Joan had gone to pray, her heart restless, needing clarity. She knelt before the Virgin's image, the candles trembling in their small glass cups, their flames bending as if in a secret wind. And then it came again, the voice, but not only the voice. With it came presence. She turned her head slightly, and though no figure could be held in full, there was light, soft, golden, not like sun but like warmth given form. The voice named itself, Michael the Archangel. Catherine, Margaret, saints she had heard of, prayed to, sung about in hymns. But here, they did not belong to painted wood or stained glass. They spoke with clarity, as one might speak across a table. Her breath caught. She lowered her eyes, overwhelmed. But the voices urged her not to fear. They told her of God's plan. They told her that she, a girl of Domremy, was to be his instrument. That she would raise France from despair. That she must go to the Dauphin, crown him, and restore the land. The words were beyond her reach. She felt as though she were being asked to step into a river at flood. Her family, her neighbours, the priests who taught her prayers. What would they say if she confessed this? Who would believe a girl who claimed to hear saints? But the voices were not asking for others to believe. They were asking for her to believe. She tried to resist. She thought of her tasks, tending sheep, spinning wool, keeping her family's trust. She thought of her age, her smallness, her ignorance of war. Yet the saints pressed her with the calm insistence of those who know the outcome already written. They did not argue, they did not plead. They declared, and with each declaration she felt her heart pulled taut as if strung on a bow. She felt fear, yes, but also a strange exhilaration, the idea that God had looked at her, not priests, not kings, not nobles, and chosen her. After that day, the voices did not remain distant. They came often, guiding, teaching, encouraging. She learned to know their tones. Michael strong and commanding, Catherine tender but firm, Margaret with a voice like a sister. They became her unseen companions, filling her nights with direction. Still, she hesitated. The step from hearing to doing was vast. How could she walk into castles and claim authority? She wrestled in silence, her prayers longer, her thoughts deeper. She knew her family saw her change. Her mother asked if she was ill. Her father said she seemed lost in thought too often. Joan only nodded, offering no explanation. How could she? To tell them would be to break the fragile seed before it sprouted. And so she kept her secret by the doorway of the church, kneeling often, listening more than speaking, until the voices shaped her into readiness. The village of Domremy was small, tucked among fields and hedges, a place where gossip travelled faster than carts. When Joan began to speak quietly, carefully about her visions, it was not long before whispers filled the air. At first she told only a few, a priest she trusted, a neighbour she considered wise. They listened with furrowed brows, with curiosity, with the caution of those who had seen superstition ruin lives. Was she touched by grace or by delusion? The line was thin. Some villagers nodded in belief. They knew Joan's reputation, pious, honest, never one to wander in sin or folly. Her devotion to Mass, her reverence for saints, her quiet demeanour, all testified in her favour. If she said she heard voices, perhaps she did. Others scoffed. A girl leading armies, a farm child commanding nobles. It sounded like foolishness at best, danger at worst. The English still pressed hard against French soil. The war was long, bloody, and uncertain. To claim divine mandate was not only strange, it was perilous. The priest of the village, cautious but not dismissive, questioned her. He asked what the voices said. She answered plainly, without ornament, as if repeating instructions given by a trusted elder. She did not waver. He saw no sign of deceit, though he withheld judgment. Her father grew uneasy. Talk of war, of visions, of leaving home, these were threats to a father's sense of order. He told her to stay, to marry, to live as a daughter should. He warned that dreams of grandeur could end in shame, or worse, he forbade her to speak further. But forbidding did not silence the call within her. Neighbours debated at wells, at market, in fields. Some admired her courage. Others feared the attention such claims could bring from church officials, from lords, from soldiers. Domremy was small. It had survived by staying unnoticed. Joan's words promised to make it noticed in ways no one desired. Through it all, Joan remained steady. She did not argue. She did not seek to persuade. She simply spoke what she had heard and stood by it, unshaken. Her certainty unnerved those who doubted and strengthened those who believed. In time, the whispers reached beyond the village. Stories of the girl who heard voices of saints began to travel, small at first, like sparks on dry grass. But sparks, in the right wind, can grow into fire. Joan's village weighed her vision, some with faith, some with fear. But Joan herself no longer weighed it. She carried it as one carries a burden given by heaven too heavy to set aside, too sacred to deny. The voices had grown more insistent. Each time she knelt to pray, each time she lay down at night, they pressed her with the same command: go. Leave the fields, leave the village, seek out the Dauphin, speak for God, not for yourself. Every day, the instruction seemed less like suggestion and more like breath itself, impossible to ignore. She felt as though her whole life had become a road pointing forward, even as her family tried to hold her in place. The moment of separation came quietly, yet with finality. Joan knew that if she were to travel through lands filled with soldiers, thieves, and suspicion, she could not walk as a girl. To appear in villages dressed as she always had linen dress, hair loose around her shoulders, would invite trouble at every turn. Worse, it would make men laugh before she had spoken a word. The saints had told her, "You must dress as a man." The idea both frightened and steadied her. Frightened because she knew how such an act would be seen. Immodest, improper, dangerous. But steadied because it solved what her heart already knew, that only in armour, only in the guise of one ready for war, could she move as her mission required. She thought of the banner she would one day carry, white and pure, and saw that purity did not lie in the cut of cloth, but in the obedience of the soul. So, in a small chamber lit only by a lamp, she took shears to her hair. The strands fell heavy, each cut a quiet rebellion against the life expected of her. Her long dark locks, the sign of her youth and her womanhood, scattered across the dirt floor. With each cut, she felt both lighter and more marked, as if the world she had known fell away with the hair. When she emerged, her family gasped. Her father's anger was immediate, his words harsh, accusing her of shame, of dishonour. He did not see purpose, he saw only disgrace. Her mother's eyes filled with tears, torn between fear for her daughter's soul and awe at her unwavering expression. Joan did not flinch beneath their judgment. She held her head high, her cropped hair framing a face no less feminine, but now set with resolve that looked far older than her years. She clothed herself in garments, not her own hose, tunic, boots laced high. She fastened a belt around her waist and felt the weight of change settle fully upon her. To the village she would look strange, perhaps even cursed, but to herself she felt clothed in obedience, as though the saints themselves had wrapped her in their mantle. That night she prayed aloud, not whispering, but speaking clear and steady. She asked not for ease, not for permission, but for strength. The saints did not comfort her with softness. They reassured her with certainty. They told her this step was necessary, and she felt peace in her chest, a peace made of iron. The next morning, whispers followed her through the village. Some scoffed, others crossed themselves nervously, uncertain if what they saw was holy or heretical. Children stared openly. Men muttered. Women shook their heads. Yet Joan walked with quiet dignity, no longer shrinking from their gaze. She knew she had severed more than hair. She had severed the life she could never return to. The field, the loom, the ordinary path of marriage and motherhood were gone. Ahead lay only the road, and the road was calling her name. Leaving her village was not like stepping across a boundary in the soil. It was like crossing from one world into another. Behind her were familiar fields, known faces, the rhythm of days that had shaped her childhood. Ahead stretched uncertainty, danger, the vastness of war. Yet she carried no fear heavy enough to stop her steps. She carried instead the fire of conviction, which burned stronger with every mile. The road wound through forests and towns, scarred by conflict. The 100 Years' War had pressed its shadow into every village, leaving charred beams and hungry eyes. Soldiers moved like wolves across the land, some loyal to France, some to England, many loyal only to coin. Joan travelled with a small escort men who had heard of her visions, who were drawn by curiosity, faith, or simply the desire to see if a girl could truly do what she claimed. They rode by night when danger was thickest, trusting that God would cover their tracks. At times they disguised themselves, slipping past checkpoints where soldiers demanded tolls and questioned travellers. Joan's short hair, her man's clothes, her quiet authority, these made her appear as more than she was, and often enough, it was enough. The winter air bit hard at their faces. Snow fell heavy, clinging to the trees, muffling the hooves of their horses. At inns, they found suspicion more often than welcome. Who was this strange young rider, with cropped hair and eyes that seemed too steady for her age? Joan answered few questions, speaking only when necessary, her voice calm, her gaze unwavering. Her companions began to sense something in her presence. She did not boast, she did not chatter. But when spirits flagged, she lifted them with simple words. God goes before us. When danger pressed close, she seemed unshaken, as though an unseen wall surrounded her. The men began to believe, not because she convinced them, but because the journey itself seemed to protect her. At last they reached Vaucouleurs, a stronghold loyal to the Dauphin. The captain there, Robert de Baudricourt, was a seasoned soldier, weary of both politics and superstition. When Joan requested to see him, his laughter filled the hall. A girl claiming divine voices? A farmer's daughter demanding an audience with the Dauphin? It was absurd. He dismissed her outright, telling her to go home, to tend her sheep. But Joan returned again and again. She stood before him without trembling, repeating the message of the saints. She told him France would not be saved by generals or treaties, but by God, and that God had chosen her as his instrument. Her persistence unsettled him. He mocked, but he also watched. And then reports began to arrive, small victories she had predicted, turns in battle she had spoken of before they came. Whispers grew that this girl might indeed be touched by heaven. The people of Vaucouleurs, weary of war and hungry for hope, began to see her not as foolish but as chosen. Women knelt when she passed. Men crossed themselves. Robert de Baudricourt could no longer laugh. Reluctantly, and perhaps fearing that to deny her might be to deny God, he gave her what she sought, an escort to the Dauphin. Joan received a horse, a sword, and the blessing to continue. She left Vaucouleurs not as a girl pretending to be a soldier, but as a figure gathering the weight of prophecy. She did not ride with arrogance. She rode with the same quiet calm as when she had cut her hair. Yet in the eyes of those who watched her depart, there was something unmistakable, a sense that history itself had begun to move with her. The journey to the Dauphin's court stretched long and perilous. Over mountains, across rivers, through forests thick with danger, Joan and her small company pressed forward. The air was knife-sharp with winter cold. Snow muffled the earth, turning every path into a mirror of white. The horses sank deep with each step, their breath steaming in the frosted dark. They rode by night more often than day, for night gave cover. English patrols haunted the roads, and bandits prowled where law had broken. By torchlight and starlight, Joan rode at the centre of the group, her banner still only a thought, but her presence already its own light. She spoke little, conserving her breath, conserving her strength. At times the men quarrelled, weary of hunger, of cold, of fear. But Joan's composure steadied them. She reminded them of why they rode not for coin, not for pride, but for France, for God's will. Her words were not flowery, they were simple, plain, but they carried a weight that silenced complaint. She spoke as one who believed completely, and belief is a fire that warms even the coldest night. They crossed rivers where ice cracked beneath hooves. They passed villages where roofs sagged under snow, where faces peered from windows with hollow eyes. War had emptied barns, taken sons, left widows. Joan saw it all and carried it within her. The suffering of her people pressed deeper into her resolve. Each hungry child, each ruined home, became another reason to keep riding. There were moments of danger. An English patrol glimpsed on a ridge, the distant sound of hooves that forced them into silence among the trees. Each time they escaped. Some called it luck, others miracle. Joan herself said little, but she prayed with her eyes lifted toward the frozen stars, and her prayers seemed to make the road bend for them. When fatigue threatened, she urged them onward. When spirits sagged, she reminded them of the Dauphin waiting, of the coronation yet to come. Her conviction became their compass. They began to trust not only her words, but her very presence, as though simply riding beside her offered protection. At last, after days that blurred into nights, they neared Chinon, where the Dauphin held his court. The castle rose above the Loire, its towers sharp against the winter sky. For Joan, it was the end of one road and the beginning of another. She had left her village, cut her hair, faced doubt, endured cold, evaded enemies. Now she would step into halls where stone weighed heavier than snow, where words cut sharper than swords. But as she looked up at the castle in the pale morning light, she felt no fear. She had not ridden through winter to falter at a threshold. She whispered a prayer, simple and steady, the same words she had carried since the first voice in the field. God, be my help. And the gates of Chinon loomed before her. The castle at Chinon was heavy with the damp of winter stone. Torches hissed as they burned, dripping wax onto walls that had heard centuries of councils and betrayals. Courtiers moved through the great hall like slow rivers, their words carried in murmurs and half-smiles. Joan entered this place not as a noble, not as a soldier, but as a girl from the fields, riding a borrowed horse, carrying a mission that sounded impossible. She had never been in a room so vast. The hall seemed to stretch forever, its shadows clinging high above in the beams. At its far end, the Dauphin lingered, surrounded by men who studied every move he made. Charles, pale and uncertain, was a prince shaped more by doubt than destiny. Around him, advisers whispered caution. They told him of this girl who claimed visions, who dressed as a man, who demanded audience as though sent from heaven itself. They called her dangerous, foolish, perhaps even heretical. Yet desperation has a way of softening skepticism. France was broken, its people starved for hope, and even a whisper of heaven could not be ignored. Joan walked the length of the hall. She had been told the Dauphin would test her. He had disguised himself among his courtiers, standing not upon the throne but in plain clothing, blending with his men. He thought she would falter, that she would bow to the wrong man and expose herself as an impostor. Yet when she entered, her eyes moved through the crowd with calm assurance. She passed by nobles adorned with gold, by men in garments finer than anything she had ever seen. She walked past them all until she stopped before a man dressed simply, a man whose shoulders seemed bent beneath invisible weight. She bowed her head. "Gentle Dauphin," she said, "God has sent me to you." The hall fell silent. Whispers swelled in the corners, faces stiff with unease. The Dauphin himself felt the air shift. How could she have known? What trick could explain such certainty? Yet Joan's gaze did not waver. She spoke with the plainness of truth, not as one seeking favour, but as one delivering command. She told him she carried letters for him, words of promise, sealed with the weight of her mission. She had come not to entertain, not to be tested, but to deliver God's message. He was rightful king, and he must be crowned at Reims. She spoke of victories to come, of Orleans delivered, of a France restored. Her words, though simple, struck with the force of prophecy. Charles, hesitant and weary, listened as though torn between belief and fear. He had known only defeat. He had been raised among courtiers who bargained more than they dreamed. But here stood a girl who looked at him not as a pawn but as a chosen king. She spoke not to his doubt but to his destiny. The Dauphin accepted her letter. He broke the seal with careful hands, eyes scanning the script that repeated her claim. She was sent by God to lead France to freedom. His counsellors frowned, whispering objections, their suspicion sharp. Yet Charles could not shake the calm weight of her presence. In her voice was no hesitation, no courtly flattery, only conviction. When she finished speaking, the hall exhaled at last. Some scoffed openly, others muttered prayers, but none could dismiss her outright. She had pierced the Dauphin's disguise, spoken with clarity, and laid her purpose at his feet. Whether saint or madwoman, she had forced them all to listen, and so the Dauphin did not dismiss her. He set in motion examinations, counsels, questions. The church would probe her soul, judges would weigh her words, but the first door had opened. Joan of Arc, daughter of Domremy, had walked into a royal court with nothing but her visions, and left it with the ear of a king. Orleans was choking. Its walls groaned under siege, its people gaunt from hunger. Fires burned at the edges of the city, where English engines hurled stone and fire without mercy. Months had dragged on, each day eroding both stone and spirit. The city was the key to France. If it fell, the heart of the Dauphin's realm would collapse. Joan arrived in this crucible, not with sword drawn, but with a banner, white, pure, stitched with the name of Jesus and the lilies of France. She carried it as one carries a torch into darkness, not to kill, but to reveal. Soldiers who had grown weary of endless struggle looked at her and felt their shoulders lift. Her presence was not of war's brutality, but of hope's defiance. She walked the streets of Orleans and saw the hollow faces of the starving. She saw mothers clutching thin children, men too weak to stand, walls pocked with the scars of constant attack. Yet she did not shrink from the sight. She told them the siege would be broken, that God had declared it so. Her certainty became food, her voice water to parched souls. The commanders, hardened men who measured everything in supplies and strategy, hesitated. What could a girl know of siegecraft? Yet even they could not deny the rising tide she carried with her. Where despair had ruled, now men spoke of courage. Where surrender had seemed near, now the idea of victory began to stir. The English mocked her. They shouted from their lines, calling her cowgirl, witch, whore of the Armagnacs. They laughed at her banner, at her claims of divine voices. But their laughter carried a tremor. They knew that fear is a fragile thing, and that one spark of faith can undo months of siege. When the moment came, Joan entered battle not with the calculation of generals, but with the fire of conviction. She stood at the front, her banner raised, her voice carrying above the clash of steel and the thunder of engines. She urged the men forward, calling them to fight not as mercenaries but as instruments of heaven. An arrow struck her shoulder, piercing flesh, dropping her to the ground. The men gasped, their courage faltering. But Joan, teeth gritted against pain, rose again. She refused to be carried off the field. She lifted her banner high with blood still flowing down her arm. Her cry carried across the field, "In the name of God, forward." And they did. Walls were stormed, bridges crossed, English lines broken. By day's end, Orleans was no longer a tomb but a city reborn. The siege lifted like smoke, and the bells of the city rang until they seemed to shake the very sky. In the ashes of burned houses, amid the ruins of shattered walls, a new France was born. Soldiers bowed before her, citizens wept in gratitude. For the first time in years, hope stood taller than despair, and in the heart of that hope was Joan, a girl who had come with nothing but a banner and a voice. The days that followed Orleans became legend even before they had ended. Word spread like fire across the land. The maid had come, and with her, victory. Men who had grown numb to war began to whisper prayers again. Farmers lifted their heads from weary fields and spoke of miracles. The English, once certain of their dominance, now looked over their shoulders at shadows cast by a single banner. Joan knew victory was fragile. Orleans was a spark, but sparks die quickly without breath to feed them. She pressed the commanders to move swiftly, to carry the momentum forward. Delay was the enemy of faith. Each day lost was a stone placed back in the wall of despair. The soldiers who followed her carried not only swords but stories. They spoke of her wounds healed with prayer, of her visions guiding strategy, of her unshaken purity. Whether every tale was true mattered less than the effect they carried. Men marched with lighter steps, their hearts set not only on survival but on destiny. When they faced the English again, Joan stood as she always did, banner raised, eyes fixed not on men but on heaven. The breach in the walls loomed, a gap wide enough for victory, narrow enough for slaughter. To enter was to risk all. The men hesitated, knowing the first to cross might not return. Joan did not hesitate. She pressed forward, her banner the first across the opening. The sight of her, radiant in armour, flag bright against the smoke, shattered their fear. They surged after her, voices rising, weapons clashing, the air filled with the thunder of renewed courage. The breach became not a place of death, but of rebirth. French forces poured through, scattering the enemy, reclaiming ground thought lost forever. The English faltered, shaken not only by the assault, but by the sight of their enemy carried by faith that seemed unbreakable. When the dust settled, Joan stood in the breach, banner still raised, her face streaked with sweat and blood, her eyes alight with the fire of certainty. She had not fought with blade, but with presence, yet her influence had been more decisive than any weapon. The men gathered around her, exhausted but exultant. They shouted her name, calling her the Maid, the Saviour, the Chosen. Joan bowed her head, giving the glory not to herself, but to God. Yet even she must have felt the shift in the air. France had turned. The banner she carried was no mere cloth. It had become a symbol stronger than any fortress wall. Wherever it flew, despair weakened. Wherever it rose, the breach widened, and through it marched a people no longer content to bow their heads beneath the yoke of defeat. And so, from Orleans to the fields beyond, her banner led the way, not of conquest, but of conviction, not of empire, but of faith. And with every step, Joan knew the voices had spoken true. She was to raise the Dauphin, crown him, and free her people. The breach was only the beginning. The battle at Orleans had not ended in a single moment of triumph, but in a long, punishing wave of struggle. Smoke hung low, arrows cut through the sky in shrill arcs, and the clash of iron rang like hammers striking anvils. The English lines were fierce, unyielding, and their fortifications heavy with defences. Joan had pressed forward with her banner, lifting hearts with the certainty in her voice, when the moment of blood came. An arrow, heavy and sharp, whistled through the air and struck her in the shoulder. The force hurled her back, the pain searing through her body with such violence that her vision blurred. She staggered, fell to one knee, and for a moment the men around her faltered as if the light itself had dimmed. Their eyes went wide, voices cracked in fear, and the line that had surged forward began to hesitate. For them, Joan was not just a commander, she was the sign that God's favour rested with them. Seeing her fall was like watching a banner sink into the mud. The English saw it too, and their jeers rose sharp and cruel. "The witch is struck! She bleeds like any other!" they cried across the field. Their laughter mingled with the ringing of arms, a cruel music meant to cut deeper than steel. Joan felt the pain burning through her body, a weight that pressed down and threatened to keep her on the ground. Hands reached for her, men trying to carry her back, to remove her from the fight. But she shook her head, gritted her teeth, and refused. She pulled the arrow from her shoulder with her own hand, blood pouring down her arm, her face pale but unflinching. She called for her banner, demanded it be placed back in her grasp, and with trembling arms she lifted it high again. The men saw her rise, saw her blood staining her armour, and something shifted within them. Their fear melted into fury, their despair into resolve. They surged forward with cries that shook the air, pressing the English back with renewed strength. To them, Joan's refusal to retreat was proof enough that heaven still walked beside them. She pressed on, not with sword, but with presence, her pain hidden behind the calm of her eyes. She prayed under her breath with every step, her words lost in the thunder of battle but steady on her lips. "Jesus, Mary, be my strength." By nightfall, the English lines broke. Their banners fell, their soldiers fled, and the gates of Orléans opened wide to receive the victors. Bells rang out, echoing across the city like a tide of joy. Joan, her arm bound with linen soaked red, entered with her banner still raised. The people crowded the streets, some weeping, others shouting her name, many falling to their knees as if in the presence of a miracle. She did not smile, she did not revel in their adoration. She bowed her head, giving thanks to God, her voice quiet even as the city thundered around her. The wound in her shoulder throbbed for days, but she bore it with silence. Pain mattered little beside purpose. The voices had told her to lead, and she would lead even if it meant bleeding in every battle. For Joan, her return from the edge of death was not an end, but a sign. Nothing, not pain nor arrow, could halt what God had set in motion. The morning after the siege lifted, Orléans stirred to life in a way it had not for months. Smoke still rose from the ruins, and walls still bore the marks of fire and stone, yet the air carried something it had not known in a long time: freedom. Bells rang again, not to call to arms, but to call to thanksgiving. Market stalls opened timidly. Children wandered the streets without fear of arrows raining from the sky, and men who had grown thin with despair walked with straightened backs. Joan moved through the city like a quiet flame. Crowds gathered wherever she went, pressing close, reaching to touch her cloak or banner. They called her the Maid, the Saviour, the one sent by heaven. Mothers brought their children to her. Soldiers knelt at her feet. Priests raised prayers of thanks for her coming. She accepted none of it for herself. Each time, she pointed upward. "It is God who has delivered you," she told them. But even as the people rejoiced, whispers grew louder in the halls of command. The captains, hardened men of war, spoke of strategy, of regrouping, of moving carefully. They praised her victory, but spoke with caution, uneasy at her authority. Was this girl now to dictate their campaigns? Was her banner to lead armies while they, men of rank and years of service, became her followers? The Dauphin too listened from afar. He rejoiced in the victory, yet he also weighed the unsettling power she carried, for it was not only soldiers who followed her, it was the people. Their hearts, long disillusioned by nobles and priests, clung to her as if she were the last candle in darkness. Joan herself thought little of politics. She cared only for what the voices had told her: to press forward, to crown the Dauphin, to free France. Delay was her enemy, hesitation a sin against obedience. She urged the commanders to strike again, to ride quickly while the English reeled from defeat. "Strike while God has opened the way," she pleaded. But the generals measured supplies, weighed risks, and counselled patience. Patience was not her gift. She pressed harder, her words simple but unwavering. "God has given France into your hands. Do not let fear steal what heaven has granted." For the common soldier, her presence was worth more than 100 spears. They had seen her wounded and rise again. They had seen her stand unflinching in battle, her banner glowing white against smoke and fire. To them she was not a strategist, but a sign. When she spoke, they listened. When she prayed, they prayed with her. When she walked among them at dawn, they felt the weight of despair lift from their shoulders. The city, though scarred, began to breathe again. Fires were put out, walls repaired, graves dug for the fallen. Yet, beneath the relief lay a question that none dared speak aloud. Was this only one victory, or the beginning of a tide that could sweep the English from all of France? Joan believed the latter without hesitation. The dawn after victory was not rest, it was the call to march again. To her, Orléans was not the end, but the start. The light that now flickered in France must be fanned into flame, lest it die as quickly as it had come. The road back to Chinon was filled with echoes of triumph. Messengers rode ahead with news of Orléans, their voices carrying tales of the maid who had broken the siege. Villages along the way opened their gates, ringing bells, offering bread and wine to the girl who rode at the centre of the column. The Dauphin's people, long crushed under the weight of war, lifted their eyes at last. Hope moved faster than the hooves of horses, and by the time Joan entered Chinon, the city already hummed with her name. Inside the great hall, the Dauphin waited. He had heard the stories, but he wanted to see her face to face. Charles sat not as a triumphant prince, but as a man uncertain of the crown that had always seemed just beyond his grasp. His advisers gathered close, their expressions guarded. Some believed Joan's victory proof of divine favour. Others saw danger, a girl rising too quickly, a force outside their control. When Joan entered, the hall stilled. She walked with the same steady stride she had shown on her first arrival. Her cropped hair tucked beneath a soldier's cap, her armour bearing the marks of battle. She carried no sword, only her banner, its white cloth glowing in the torchlight. She knelt before the Dauphin, her voice strong. "Gentle Dauphin, God has given us victory. It is his will that you be crowned at Reims." Charles studied her, his eyes heavy with doubt. He wanted to believe, yet he feared the cost of belief. To ride to Reims meant crossing enemy territory, risking his fragile claim on the throne. To trust a peasant girl with visions was to risk mockery and ruin. Yet the victory at Orléans was undeniable. She had promised, and she had delivered. The hall murmured. Some urged the Dauphin to act, to follow her while the tide favoured them. Others counselled caution, reminding him of traps, of enemies, of the need for slow deliberation. The Dauphin wavered as always. His spirit tugged between boldness and fear. Joan did not falter. She spoke not with the careful tones of politics, but with the fire of conviction. "Do not fear. God has gone before you. You are his chosen king, and he will bring you to your crown." Her words struck deeper than strategy ever could. They called to the part of Charles that longed to rise above doubt. They reminded him of a destiny he had nearly abandoned. He felt, for a moment, the weight of heaven behind him, and it steadied his shoulders. That night, Joan remained in prayer, kneeling in a small chapel lit by a single candle. She prayed for the Dauphin, for France, for the courage to carry out what had been placed upon her. The voices whispered again, urging her onward, reminding her that the path to Reims was not optional but ordained. In the long hall of Chinon, decisions were still debated, but one truth had already settled like iron. Joan of Arc was no longer just a girl from the fields. She was a force the Dauphin could not ignore, a flame that had entered his halls and refused to be extinguished. The Dauphin's advisers, unsettled by her influence, decided the next step would not be on the battlefield, but in the chamber of scholars and priests. If Joan was truly sent by God, then the church must test her. If she was false, the danger was great. A girl who swayed soldiers and nobles could not go unexamined, and so they sent her to Poitiers, where learned men would weigh her words like scales and sift her soul like grain. The journey to Poitiers carried a strange heaviness. Joan rode not to a city under siege, but to a city of minds, where questions could wound as deeply as arrows. She was no scholar. She could not match the Latin of priests, nor the arguments of theologians. Yet she did not fear. The voices had told her to speak the truth plainly, and she trusted that truth itself would stand taller than the tallest tower of learning. When she entered the hall, it was filled not with soldiers, but with clerics in robes, their eyes sharp, their quills ready. The Bishop of Castres sat among them, as did inquisitors sent to probe, men trained to detect heresy with the precision of hunters. Before them stood Joan, small in stature but unshaken. They asked her questions meant to trap. How could she prove her voices were divine and not illusions of demons? Why would God choose a peasant girl rather than a bishop or prince? Did she presume to know God's will better than his church? Each question was a net, designed to ensnare her into contradiction or pride. Joan answered not with clever argument, but with steady simplicity. I know these voices are of God, for they do not depart when I pray. They teach me to live in purity, to attend Mass, to honor the Lord. Can demons command such things? She did not falter when asked about her mission. God has sent me to raise the siege of Orléans and to bring the Dauphin to Reims to be crowned. If you would test me, let me go to battle. If it is not of God, he will not bless it. If it is, then you will see. Her words startled them. Not arrogance, but clarity. She did not seek to persuade them with her learning, but with her life. For 3 weeks they examined her, probing every claim, asking her about her visions, her voices, her vow of virginity. They even sent women to inspect her body, as though holiness could be measured by flesh. Each time she emerged, with their attempts dulled against her steadiness. She did not waver. She did not contradict herself. She did not lash out. She spoke as one certain of her path. Some among the council grew uneasy. They had expected superstition, confusion, perhaps madness. Instead, they found only conviction wrapped in innocence. They admitted privately that there was nothing false in her, nothing corrupt. There is in her only simplicity, piety, humility, and truth, one of the examiners wrote. Still, hesitation lingered. Could they risk sending a girl to lead armies? Would not the world mock them? Would it not shame France if she failed? But the siege of Orléans had already ended with her hand upon the banner. Facts argued louder than doubt. At last, the council gave its verdict. They could find no evil in her. If her mission was not of God, time would reveal it. If it was, then to deny her would be to deny heaven. With that, they sent her back to the Dauphin, their judgment written in cautious approval. Joan left Poitiers with the same calm she had carried in. She had not studied arguments, nor mastered books, but she had spoken truth, and truth had sufficed. Her path was not of parchment, but of fire, and the fire had not been quenched. The Dauphin, now convinced enough to risk, gave her what she had not yet asked for, but always expected: armour. The blacksmiths worked through days and nights, shaping steel to fit her small frame. When at last it was finished, she put it on piece by piece. The breastplate shone silver, the greaves caught the light, the helm closed around her face. She looked in the polished steel of a shield and saw not the girl from Domremy, but the figure the voices had promised, the Maid of France. Yet she asked for more than armour. She asked for a banner. Not a weapon, not a sword of renown, but a standard to bear before her in battle. She described it with precision: a field of pure white, the lilies of France upon it, and the names of Jesus and Mary in letters of gold. painted upon it the image of Christ seated in judgment, angels flanking him, blessing the work she had been called to do. When the banner was finished, she held it aloft. It was not heavy, but it carried the weight of heaven in its cloth. She did not seek glory for herself. She said often that she loved the banner 40 times more than the sword. For the sword was for killing, but the banner was for life. It went before her not to spill blood, but to proclaim the presence of God. Before she rode, her armour and banner were blessed by priests, chants echoing through the chapel, incense curling in the air. Joan knelt, her hands folded, her head bowed beneath the silver helm. She asked not for victory, not for ease, but for strength to carry out what had been commanded. When she rose, the air seemed to shift around her, as though the prayer had clothed her in something greater than steel. The soldiers gathered to watch her departure. They had seen armour before, banners before, but never like this, never upon a girl whose eyes carried such light. Many crossed themselves, some knelt, others simply stared in silence. She mounted her horse, the banner raised, her armour gleaming. The cheers that followed her were not the cheers of men for a commander, but of men for a sign. From that day on, wherever she rode, the white standard fluttered above her. It was seen first in battle, catching sunlight, lifting hearts. It became more than cloth, it was a message. Where it waved, the French surged forward. Where it fell, they faltered. It was not only her shield, but their own. She knew the banner was not hers alone. It belonged to France, to the will of God, to the mission that had begun in whispers and now thundered across fields and cities. Each time she raised it, she prayed the same prayer, that God would guide it, that it would shine brighter than any flame, that it would remind all who saw it that heaven had not abandoned them. And as the banner snapped in the wind, the men followed with courage they had thought long dead. The Dauphin's army gathered, not in despair as before, but with a strange anticipation. Villages emptied to watch them pass. Children ran to the roads, pressing flowers into soldiers' hands. Priests raised blessings as columns of men and horses thundered through. Yet the loudest cheers were not for the Dauphin nor his generals. They were for the girl in silver, carrying the white banner that seemed to gleam with its own light. The march to Reims stretched long, threading through towns where English garrisons still lingered. But something had shifted. When the people saw Joan, they did not hide. They opened their gates, offered bread, poured wine, wept openly. To them, she was not only a commander, but a sign that France still lived. The land itself seemed to lean toward her passing, as if eager to follow. Each night, as campfires flickered across fields, Joan walked among the men. She urged them to confession, to prayer. She asked them to leave behind their vices, their swearing, their lust, their quarrels. She told them the army must be pure, for it was God's instrument. And though many had laughed at such things before, they now obeyed. Rough soldiers knelt before priests, receiving absolution with tears in their eyes. Songs rose from the camps, hymns mingling with the crackle of fire, a sound unheard in years of weary war. The march moved swiftly, not because roads were easy, but because the people cleared them. Town after town opened its gates without resistance. Some surrendered before a single arrow flew. The English, unnerved by the tide of faith, abandoned positions they had thought secure. They mocked her from a distance, but they did not hold their ground when her banner appeared. At Troyes, where resistance flared, Joan spoke with such conviction that even the wavering commanders found new resolve. She urged them to press on, promising God would grant victory if they did not fear. They followed, and the city yielded. It was as if heaven itself walked with them, turning stone walls into doors. The Dauphin, riding at the centre, grew bolder as the march advanced. He saw the people kneel before him, not because of his birth, but because Joan had declared him chosen. His shoulders straightened, his voice grew stronger, though the doubt in his eyes still flickered when he was alone. He leaned on her faith as one leans on a staff, unable to walk without it. Day by day, the march became less a military campaign and more a pilgrimage. The soldiers felt it. The people felt it. Even the Dauphin began to sense it. They were not only reclaiming land, they were walking toward a destiny long delayed. And always at the front, Joan rode with her banner. The cloth rippled in wind, catching light, calling hearts. It became the thread that stitched together a broken France, town by town, mile by mile. By the time they neared Reims, the march had become legend. Songs were already being sung, stories already spreading, each retelling making the Maid larger, brighter, more impossible to deny. What had begun as whispers in Domremy had become a tide that moved all of France, and Joan knew, with each step, that the voices had spoken true. The Dauphin would be crowned, the land would rise. The march had only just begun, but it had already changed the course of history. The march had been long, the victories strung like beads upon a cord, each one pulling them closer to the heart of France. Yet all of it, the road from Orleans, the surrender of towns, the swelling of belief, was only preparation for this moment. Reims rose before them, the city where kings of France were anointed with holy oil, where the crown was not merely placed but consecrated. For centuries it had been so, and for Charles to be king in truth, he must kneel there. Without Reims, he was a claimant. With Reims, he would be God's chosen. The city's gates opened without battle. The people, weary of war and hungry for hope, welcomed the Dauphin with cheers. Bells rang from towers, echoing across the fields like a chorus of triumph. The streets filled with faces alight, children perched on shoulders, women weeping openly, men lifting their caps. And at the centre of it all rode Joan, her banner lifted, her armour gleaming despite the dust of the march. The people shouted her name as if it were already a prayer. Inside the cathedral, the air was thick with incense, the high arches soaring like arms raised in supplication. Priests moved with solemn grace, their vestments heavy with gold thread, their voices chanting ancient hymns that had crowned kings long before Charles had been born. The holy ampulla, the vial said to have been brought from heaven itself, was brought forth. It contained the oil that had anointed every true king of France. Charles stood before the altar, pale, uncertain, his lips pressed tightly, as though even in triumph he feared to believe. Yet beside him stood Joan, calm, resolute. She had promised this moment, and now it unfolded just as the voices had declared. When the archbishop dipped his thumb into the sacred oil and traced it upon Charles's forehead, when the crown was lifted and lowered upon his head, a murmur swept the cathedral like wind through leaves. The Dauphin was no longer Dauphin. He was King Charles VII. Joan knelt, tears in her eyes. She had done what seemed impossible. A girl from Domremy had brought a prince to his throne, had crowned him not with her hands, but with her faith. And yet, even in her joy, she knew this was not the end. It was only the beginning of a greater struggle. For crowns bring enemies as well as friends, and the English would not rest while France rose. Still, the day was victory. The bells of Reims rang without ceasing. People crowded the cathedral, pressing close to glimpse the crowned king, to touch Joan's banner as if it carried grace. Songs rose in the streets, torches burned through the night, and hope seemed at last to have a body, a voice, a face. The king himself turned to Joan, his eyes filled with gratitude and awe. "Never have I known such joy," he said. "You have given me my crown." Joan shook her head. "It is God who has given it," she replied. "I am only his servant." And so she stood, a figure of humility amid the blaze of triumph, the white banner raised high in the cathedral light. Reims had spoken. France had a king. The world would never forget the maid who had brought him there. The coronation was glory, but the road ahead was war. Joan knew it, the king knew it, the soldiers knew it. The English still held strong cities, still commanded armies, still whispered curses across the land. Reims was a crown, but crowns could be broken if not defended. The march did not end with triumph. It pressed on with renewed urgency. The campfires burned across fields, each one a circle of light in the night. Soldiers gathered, eating their meagre rations, sharpening blades, speaking of the next battles. The air was heavy with smoke, and the fatigue of men who had marched too long. Yet amid them walked Joan, her presence turning the camp from weary bivouac into something nearer to sanctuary. She did not laugh with them, nor boast, nor drink. She moved from circle to circle, speaking quietly, urging them to prayer. She asked them to confess their sins, to cleanse themselves, for the army was not merely of France, but of God. She spoke to them as a sister, as a shepherd of souls, reminding them that courage alone was not enough. They must be pure, for victory was holy work. At first, many resisted. These were men hardened by years of war, used to wine, to swearing, to plunder. Yet the sight of her, clad in armour, yet speaking like a priest, unsettled them. She did not command them with threats, but with conviction. Slowly they began to listen. Confessors were brought to the camp. Lines of soldiers formed, waiting to kneel, to murmur their sins, to receive absolution. Where once the night air had been filled with bawdy songs, now hymns began to rise, rough voices carrying sacred words. Joan prayed with them, her head bowed, her lips moving in steady rhythm. She asked them to fast before battle, to seek mass, to remember that they fought not for plunder but for the freedom of their people. Her sermons were not of eloquence but of fire. She spoke of faith as if it were a weapon, sharper than swords, stronger than walls. She told them that sin weighed down an army more than chains, that purity lifted it higher than wings. And the men, who had scoffed at priests, who had grown numb to chaplains, listened to her as if she spoke directly from heaven. Even the roughest soldiers began to change. Oaths faded from their lips, quarrels stilled. They followed her not only into battle but into prayer, as if both were of the same cloth. She walked among them at dawn, her banner folded at her side, her voice reminding them that the day belonged to God before it belonged to war. And when they marched not only with steel but with hymns, their voices rising across the fields, startling those who heard them. The English, listening from their walls, mocked them, called them mad, yet felt unease creep into their bones. For an army that sings is an army that cannot be broken easily. In the sermons of the camp, Joan reshaped not only battles but souls. She turned rough men into believers, soldiers into pilgrims. And as the fires burned low, as the night stretched wide, they looked at her not merely as their leader, but as their guide, the maid whose faith made them stronger than fear. The voices had told her to fight, but they had also told her to call for mercy. Joan did not desire slaughter. She desired surrender, peace, an end to the long bleeding of the land. And so she took quill in hand and wrote a letter to the English. It was not the hand of a scribe, nor the words of a diplomat, but the voice of the maid herself, direct and burning with urgency. She addressed them not as enemies, but as men. She called them to leave France, to return to their own land, to cease their destruction. She told them God had commanded it, that to resist would be to resist heaven. Yet even in warning there was mercy. She promised safe passage if they departed, forgiveness if they obeyed. Only if they refused would destruction come. Her words were carried across the lines, read aloud by heralds. The English listened, and their laughter rang harsh. "She is a witch," they cried, "a shepherd girl who dares threaten us." They mocked her banner, her visions, her claim to divine command. They shouted insults across the fields, words meant to wound and belittle. But beneath their laughter was unease, for they had seen Orléans fall. They had heard stories of towns surrendering without a fight, of soldiers confessing sins and marching as if possessed by a spirit. They mocked her with their mouths, but in their hearts a question lingered. What if she was truly sent by God? The letter spread beyond the camp. Copies were read in villages, in churches, in courts. Some saw in it arrogance, others prophecy. To the French, It was a sign that their cause was not mere politics, but justice itself. To the English, it was a thorn in their pride, a girl daring to speak as if she were equal to kings. Joan did not write again to persuade them. She had given them their chance. "The voices told me to call them to peace before war," she said simply. "I have obeyed." And with that, she prepared for battle. The letter became legend, remembered not for its diplomacy, but for its defiance. A girl, unlearned, untrained, had spoken to armies as if they were children before God. Her words cut sharper than blades, because they were written with faith, not fear. And when the battles came, the English found themselves facing not only swords and lances, but the memory of her voice, calling them to surrender before the storm. The Loire River cut across France like a spine, its waters glinting beneath the sun, its bridges standing as gateways between friend and foe. For years, the English had held fortresses along its banks, tightening their grip upon the land, using the river as both shield and sword. It was here that Joan's next trial would unfold, a series of battles strung together not by chance but by divine command. The army gathered with renewed strength after Reims, their spirits lifted by the coronation, their voices still echoing with hymns sung in stone cathedrals. But Joan knew crowns were fragile, if not defended. The voices urged her forward. The Loire was not only a river, it was a chain. And chains, once broken, can never be reforged with ease. They struck first at Jargeau, a town whose walls stood firm, defended by English garrisons, confident in their stone and steel. Joan rode at the head, her banner high, her voice carrying above the roar of battle. She urged the men not to fear, to remember that God himself fought beside them. The English rained arrows, stones hurled from engines cracked against shields, but the French pressed forward. Joan, though still a girl in years, moved among the soldiers like a seasoned commander. When the walls resisted, she demanded ladders be raised. Men hesitated, for to climb meant near certain death. But Joan seized a ladder herself, planting it against the wall, her banner rising above it. The men, shamed and inspired, surged after her. Stones struck helmets, arrows pierced flesh, yet the tide rose with her presence. The wall was breached, and by nightfall Jargeau fell. The English fled, their confidence shaken. The Loire, once their fortress, now became their trap. For Joan pressed onward without pause, her eyes set on every stronghold that lined the river. At Meung-sur-Loire, the same pattern unfolded. The French, emboldened by her certainty, fought not with hesitation, but with ferocity. Joan demanded purity still, commanding soldiers to confess before battle, to fight with clean souls. And as they advanced, it seemed to the men as though angels themselves walked among them. The English, seasoned and fierce, found themselves retreating again. Beaugency fell next, its defenders overwhelmed by the relentless tide. Towns that had once trembled under English banners now welcomed the Maid with open gates, ringing bells, weeping with joy. It was as though the river itself had turned, carrying France forward on its current. The climax came at Patay, where English forces gathered in strength. They had archers, the dreaded longbowmen who had humbled France at Crécy and Agincourt. The French remembered those battles with dread, remembered the slaughter, the humiliation. Yet Joan told them plainly, this time it will not be so. This time the English will be broken. The French cavalry, driven by her words, charged with fury. The English, unprepared, faltered before they could set their stakes. Their formation collapsed, their archers scattered. It was a rout, sudden and total. The English commander was captured, their army shredded. Patay was more than a battle. It was revenge for years of humiliation, a reversal of history itself. The French, once broken, now stood triumphant. Soldiers embraced, wept, raised their voices in praise. They looked at Joan as if she were no longer human, but a vessel of heaven's will. The Loire campaign ended with the river cleared. the English driven back, their aura of invincibility shattered. For the first time in a generation, France did not feel cursed. It felt chosen. And at the centre of it all rode Joan, her banner snapping in the wind, her eyes steady with the knowledge that this was only one step upon a longer road. After the Loire, the momentum seemed unstoppable. Town after town yielded, armies crumbled, the people rose with fresh hope. The coronation at Reims had crowned a king. The victories along the Loire had crowned a people. Now Joan urged the next step, the boldest yet, Paris. Paris was not merely a city, it was the heart of France, though at that moment it beat under English rule and Burgundian alliance. To reclaim it would be to reclaim the soul of the kingdom. To march upon it was to strike at the very centre of enemy power. Many counselled caution. The king, cautious by nature, wavered. But Joan pressed him. God has given us victory. Shall we stop now, when the prize is before us? The march toward Paris carried both triumph and tension. The soldiers followed eagerly, but the court whispered. Advisers feared the risk, feared failure. They reminded Charles that Paris was heavily fortified, its defenders numerous, its allies cunning. But Joan would not be swayed. She had not been sent to pause. She had been sent to act. As they drew near, the people along the roads welcomed them with cries of joy. They believed Paris would fall as Orléans had, as Jargeau, Meung, Beaugency, Patay. They saw Joan's banner and felt certainty bloom in their chests. The maid had never lied. She had never faltered. Paris would be no different. When at last they reached the gates, the city stood silent, its walls looming, its defenders ready. Joan rode to the front, her banner raised, her voice calling out for surrender. She urged the defenders to yield, to join France, to spare their lives. But the gates remained shut, the response silence broken only by the creak of war machines upon the walls. Battle came swift. The French pressed forward, scaling ladders, shields raised, arrows raining down. Joan moved at the front, urging them on. She seemed tireless, her voice rising above the chaos, her banner gleaming white against the smoke. Yet Paris was not like Orléans. Its walls were thick, its defenders stubborn, its resolve hard as stone. The fighting raged through the day. Joan herself was struck by a crossbow bolt, the iron piercing her thigh. She fell, pain lancing through her body. The men faltered, for when she stumbled, they felt heaven falter too. Yet even wounded, she refused to leave. She demanded to be carried close, to keep her banner raised within sight of the walls. She cried out to the soldiers, urging them not to despair, her voice trembling with pain but unbroken. The assault, though fierce, could not break the city. By nightfall, the order came to withdraw. The men obeyed with heavy hearts, their faces pale, their voices silent. For the first time, Joan had promised victory, and it had not come. She wept as they carried her from the field, the bolt still in her leg, her blood soaking the earth. She wept not for her wound, but for the people who had trusted, who had believed, and who now felt the sting of disappointment. She prayed aloud, asking God why he had withheld the city. The voices did not answer with triumph, but with mystery. Paris had not fallen. And in that failure, the tide began to turn. The retreat from Paris weighed heavily upon all. The soldiers, though loyal, murmured in their tents. The people, once so certain, asked quiet questions. The court, always suspicious, found its whispers sharpened into accusations. And at the centre of it all stood Charles, crowned king, but still a man of hesitation. He had trusted Joan when she brought him to Reims. He had followed her through the Loire, basked in her victories, leaned upon her faith when his own faltered. But Paris had shaken him. Failure, even small, was a seed of doubt, and doubt, once planted, grows quickly in the soil of politics. Advisers circled him, men who feared Joan's rise, who saw in her not a saint but a threat. They told him she was dangerous, reckless, a peasant girl who did not know her place. They urged him to slow, to make treaties, to negotiate rather than fight. They reminded him that war was costly, that France was weary, that he was king now and must act with prudence. Joan pleaded with him still. "Sire, do not stop now. The English are weak, they are frightened. God has given them into our hands. Press on, and all of France will be yours." Her voice carried the same fire as always, but Charles heard only the shadow of Paris. He shook his head, hesitated, listened to others. In his heart, he wanted peace, not war. He wanted rest, not battle. He wanted safety, not risk. Joan offered him crowns through fire. His counsellors offered him comfort through compromise. He began to lean toward them. Joan felt the shift. She saw it in his eyes, in the way he looked at her not with faith but with weariness. She knew her voices were true, but she also knew kings were weak. And she feared that the greatest danger was not the English, but the doubt of the very man she had crowned. She prayed more fervently, spending long nights in chapels, her knees pressed into stone, her whispers rising into silence. She asked God to strengthen the king, to keep him from faltering. Yet each day she saw him drift further from her, pulled by those who feared her light. The banner still fluttered, the soldiers still followed, but the crown she had secured now weighed heavy upon a king too timid to bear it. And Joan, who had carried him to glory, began to feel the first chill of betrayal. The winter after Paris was restless. Joan had not stopped urging campaigns, had not stopped pressing the king to strike at the enemy while the favour of heaven still burned. But Charles had grown hesitant, heavy with counsel from men who valued treaties more than battles. And while he delayed, the English gathered strength. Worse still, Burgundy, whose loyalty had long been a shifting shadow, began to weave its own designs. Burgundy was neither wholly friend nor wholly foe. Its duke, Philip the Good, had traded allegiance like coin, sometimes leaning to France, often to England, but always to Burgundy's advantage. To Joan the matter was simple. Burgundy stood between France and freedom. To Charles it was more complex, tangled in bloodlines and politics. Where Joan saw betrayal, he saw potential alliance. Joan longed to march against Burgundy's strongholds, to shatter their hold and drive the English wedge from France's side. She prayed and pleaded, warning that delay would invite danger. The king listened with a distant gaze, nodding but never acting. His courtiers, suspicious of her growing influence, whispered louder each day. They said she was reckless, that her victories had been chance, that her failure at Paris was proof enough. And so, where once she had been at the heart of every council, she found herself slowly pushed aside. Still, she could not sit idle. With the small forces left to her, she sought skirmishes, raids, places where she might strike a blow for France. She did not wait for royal permission. She rode where the voices urged, and in these smaller battles she still shone, still lifted her banner, still rallied men who would follow her into fire. But Burgundy was watching. Philip had not forgotten the shame of France's revival, the sting of Joan's victories. He saw in her both a threat and an opportunity. If he could capture her, deliver her to the English, he would gain favour and secure his standing. The snare was set in Compiègne, a city besieged by Burgundian forces. Joan entered the city with her banner, determined to break the siege as she had at Orleans. She rode at dawn and dusk, speaking to the people, assuring them God had not abandoned them. The defenders, weary but inspired, swore they would fight. When the moment came, she led a sortie against the Burgundian lines, her banner raised, her voice clear even above the clash of steel. The fight was fierce, the enemy pressed hard. At first, the French gained ground, but as the tide shifted, she called the retreat, urging her men back toward the gates. She remained at the rear, holding her banner high to protect their withdrawal. The gates closed too soon. The defenders, panicked, shut the city to save themselves. Joan found herself outside, surrounded, her men scattering or cut down. She fought to push back, but her sword was no match for the press of enemies. Hands seized her, pulled her from her horse, tore the banner from her grasp. She was dragged away, struggling, her cries lost in the din. The Maid of Orleans, the girl who had crowned a king, was taken alive. The Burgundians rejoiced. Word spread like wildfire. France wept, England celebrated, and Joan, bound and bruised, stared upward at the sky, whispering prayers into the silence. She had always known her mission carried danger, but she had not foreseen betrayal from within the very gates she fought to defend. The snare had closed, and in its teeth was the hope of a nation. Her captors held her in towers and dungeons, moving her from place to place, always under guard. She was a prize too great to be left unguarded. Burgundy knew her value, and England desired her more than any fortress. For to hold Joan was to hold the spirit of France in chains. She prayed in her cell, prayed when guards mocked her, prayed when silence pressed heavy upon the stone. She asked for strength, for patience, for clarity. The voices still came, though softer now, as if speaking through veils. They urged her not to fear, to endure, to trust that God's will was greater than the designs of men. Yet she was human still. At times she wept, thinking of Domremy, of the fields where she had once walked freely, of the chapel where she had first heard the saints. She thought of her family, her mother's hands, her father's voice. She thought of the crown upon Charles's head, the victory at Rheims, the bells of Orleans. And she wondered, had she done enough? Her captors mocked her clothing, her armour, her visions. They called her witch, sorceress, harlot. They accused her of pride, of presumption, of stepping beyond her place. Yet even in their scorn they feared her, for she was no ordinary prisoner, she was a symbol, and symbols cannot be easily killed without risk of making them stronger. Negotiations began. Burgundy bargained with England. Gold was promised, alliances secured. France, silent, offered nothing. Charles, the king she had crowned, made no move to ransom her, no army sent to free her. He who owed his crown to her now turned his face away, hiding behind treaties and timidity. The silence was heavier than chains. Joan had risked all for him, had bled for him, had raised him from Dauphin to king. And now, when her hands were bound, he abandoned her. It was betrayal not with sword but with silence, and it cut deeper than any wound. Still, she endured. Each day she prayed, each night she whispered her faith into darkness. She remembered the voices, the saints, the fire of certainty. She told herself that her mission was not hers to measure. It was God's, and God would see it finished in his time. And so the captive remained silent, her strength unbroken, though her body was chained. The world outside shifted, alliances hardened, England prepared for her trial. But in the stillness of her cell, Joan's faith did not falter. Her silence spoke louder than her captor's jeers, for within it was the echo of a truth they could not crush, that heaven had touched earth through her. The English brought her to Rouen, a city under their control, a place where they could command the court, shape the judgment, and silence dissent. There, in a great hall turned tribunal, they gathered bishops, inquisitors, clerks, and lawyers. They dressed their intent in the robes of justice, but their aim was clear from the beginning, to destroy her not only as a soldier, but as a symbol. She was led in chains before them, her hair cropped short, her eyes steady. The hall was filled with men of learning, men of power, men whose words could condemn or acquit. She stood alone, a peasant girl against the machinery of church and crown, yet she did not tremble. They questioned her about her visions. Who were the saints? What did they say? How could she prove they were of God? She answered with patience, her voice calm, her words simple. She spoke of St. Catherine, of St. Margaret, of the Archangel Michael, of how they had guided her, strengthened her, commanded her to lift the siege, to crown the king. They tried to trap her with cunning. They asked about God's will, about the church's authority, about the obedience of women. They asked if she was in God's grace. It was a question designed to ensnare, for to answer yes would be pride, and to answer no would be confession of sin. She paused, prayed, then answered, "If I am not, may God place me there. If I am, may God keep me there." The hall murmured, astonished at the wisdom of one untrained. They pressed her on her clothing. Why did she wear men's garments? Why did she persist? She explained calmly, to protect her among soldiers, to guard her vow of purity. They called it sin, she called it necessity. Day after day, they questioned, scribes scratching every word, their pens like daggers. They hoped to wear her down, to catch her in contradiction, to twist her words into snares. Yet she stood steady, her answers clear, her faith unshaken. Still, the outcome was never in doubt. The English demanded her death, and the court, bound by politics, would deliver it. The trial was less a search for truth than a theatre of power. They sought to prove her a heretic, a witch, a fraud, so that her victories could be stripped of divine light, reduced to trickery and sin. Joan knew it. She saw it in their eyes, in their questions. Yet she did not yield. She prayed each night in her cell, prayed each morning before entering the hall. She asked for strength, not escape. She told her judges she was God's servant, and no threat, no promise, no chain could change that. And so the trial began, a stage set for betrayal cloaked in the language of law. The girl who had crowned a king now stood accused by the church she had defended, abandoned by the crown she had raised. Yet, even as the gavel of condemnation hung above her, her voice carried the same calm truth. She had obeyed God, and she would not repent of obedience. The trial did not unfold in a single moment, but stretched across weeks, each day a new battlefield without swords or banners. Joan faced not armoured men, but robed judges, not arrows, but questions sharpened like blades. Her prison was her courtroom, and each interrogation a siege. The English sat in the shadows, waiting, watching, certain that the church would hand them her head. From morning until evening they pressed her, sometimes with patience, sometimes with fury, always with the weight of authority. They demanded details of her visions. What voices? What forms? Were they clothed? Did they speak in French or in tongues unknown? Were they angels or demons? Did they promise her reward or demand her blood? They sought contradictions, cracks, anything to unravel her certainty. Joan answered, as she always had, simply, without flourish, without fear. I saw St. Catherine, St. Margaret, and the Archangel Michael. They came with light brighter than the Sunday. They counselled me to keep my vow, to live pure, to serve God and France. The scribes wrote furiously, their pens scratching like rats in the silence. Her words were preserved, not to honour her, but to be twisted. Yet even in their hands, truth glimmered. Her answers were consistent, her voice unwavering. They asked her of the king, did she not deceive him? Did she not trick him into believing she bore God's command? Joan shook her head. I told him only what God told me, that he was rightful king, that he must be crowned at Rheims. And so it was done. The judges frowned, for they could not deny what had happened. They had hoped her story would falter, that she would contradict herself. But her answers came with the steadiness of prayer. One judge, angered, struck at her with words. Do you claim God speaks to you alone? Do you claim your visions carry more weight than the church? It was the heart of their trap, for, if she placed herself above the church, they could name her heretic. Joan bowed her head. I love the church. I believe in it. But I must obey God first. He speaks through his saints. And when he commands, I obey. Murmurs filled the hall. Some judges shifted uneasily. Her words were dangerous, yet they carried the echo of conviction, not arrogance. She did not boast of power. She spoke of obedience. Day after day, they wore at her. They kept her in a cell, under guard, denied mass, denied comfort. They sought to weaken her with isolation, with hunger, with ceaseless questioning. But Joan endured as she had endured battle. She prayed in her heart. She remembered the voices. She clung to the memory of bells ringing at Reims, of banners snapping above Orléans. At times she smiled faintly, even in the face of their scorn. At times her answers silenced the hall, her wisdom disarming men who had studied for decades. She confounded them not with cunning but with innocence. And yet, behind every question, fire waited. For the trial was not meant to end in her freedom. It was built for her destruction. Every word was tinder, every answer a spark. The only question was how long she could hold before they declared the flames her destiny. Her cell was small, damp, the air heavy with rot. Iron chains rattled whenever she moved. Guards watched her night and day, some mocking, some silent, some afraid. She was a prisoner not only of stone but of politics, caught between the English who thirsted for vengeance and the church that bent under their weight. At Rouen, she was treated not as a noble captive, but as a criminal. No comfort was given, no companions allowed. She was kept in men's custody, though she had asked for women, her vow of chastity placed in constant jeopardy by rough laughter and grasping eyes. The humiliation was deliberate. They sought not only to break her body but her spirit. Still, she prayed. Kneeling on the cold floor, her lips moved in whispers through the night. The saints came to her, sometimes in light, sometimes in silence, their presence reminding her that she was not abandoned. She told her interrogators the same, though they mocked her for it. To her, even the damp stones glowed with faint traces of heaven. Chains bound her feet, yet her spirit moved freely. Guards reported seeing her kneeling for hours without motion, her face serene, her eyes lifted. Some mocked, calling her mad. Others turned away, uneasy, for something in her stillness unsettled them more than her words. When the judges visited her cell, they pressed her to recant, to confess her visions false, to admit she had been deceived. They promised mercy if she yielded, freedom even, life spared. She shook her head. I cannot deny what God has given me. Better to die than to betray him. But she was human, and the weight of chains grew heavy. At times she cried in the dark, her body racked with sobs, her faith tested by silence. She wondered why the king she had crowned had not come for her. She wondered why France, for whom she had bled, had not ransomed her. She wondered why heaven's voices seemed distant now, faint and elusive. The silence of Charles was the deepest chain of all. He remained in his court, wrapped in treaties, unwilling to risk his throne for the girl who had given it to him. His abandonment was a betrayal sharper than steel, and yet Joan did not curse him. She prayed for him, prayed for his strength, prayed that he might yet fulfill the destiny she had shown him. Even in betrayal, she held fast to mercy. The chains of Rouen sought to crush her, but they could not erase the fire within. Each rattle of iron became a reminder of her vow, each stone beneath her knees an altar. She endured, waiting, knowing the trial's end would not be mercy but martyrdom. The judges had pressed her with questions, had worn at her with chains, but still she stood, and so they set their final snare. They would draw her into contradiction, force her to choose between obedience to God and obedience to the church. If she claimed one, she condemned herself against the other. It was a trap without escape, designed with care, sharpened by cunning. They asked her again about the voices. Did she believe them above the judgment of the church? Did she claim God spoke to her directly, bypassing the authority of priests and bishops? Joan's answer was firm. God is above all. I obey him. I believe his church, but when God commands, I cannot disobey. The judges smiled thinly. That was enough. They twisted her words, declaring them proof that she placed herself above the church. They called her visions false, her obedience heresy, her persistence rebellion. Still, they sought one more step. They offered her life if she would recant, if she would sign a confession denying her voices, denouncing her mission. They promised freedom, mercy, the chance to return home. For a moment, weariness and fear pressed upon her. She was 19, young still, her body weakened by chains, her heart aching for the fields of Domremy. She wavered. At last, under threat of burning, under the weight of terror, she signed a paper she did not understand, words written by others, declaring submission. They dressed her in women's clothing again, declaring her obedience restored. The court declared victory, but heaven's call is not so easily silenced. Within days, Joan reclaimed her vow. She put on men's clothing once more, the only garments left in her cell. The voices returned, reminding her that her mission had never been hers to abandon. She had faltered, but she had not failed. The judges seized upon it. "She has relapsed," they cried. "She has returned to her heresy." It was the final trap, the one they had prepared from the beginning. By their law, relapse was unforgivable. The sentence was death. Joan stood before them once more, her face pale, but her eyes alight. She spoke not with fear, but with calm. "What I did by fear. What I am by God's command. I cannot deny him." The hall thundered with judgment. The verdict was written. The fire was prepared. The trap had closed, and Joan of Arc, the Maid of Orleans, stood condemned. Yet even in condemnation, her voice carried above the murmurs. "All that I have done was by God's command." The judges thought they had silenced her. In truth, they had only lit the first spark of her immortality. The morning of May 30th broke grey and cold, though the season was nearly summer. The city of Rouen stirred early, bells tolling not for mass but for spectacle. Word had spread through the streets. The maid was to die. The square, filled with thousands, men, women, even children, each pressed together, whispering, craning for a view. Some came with pity, others with hatred, many with curiosity. For though war had made death common, the burning of Joan of Arc was no ordinary death. She was roused from her cell before dawn. Guards unshackled her, though chains still weighed on her wrists. They clothed her in a plain gown, rough wool, no armour, no banner, nothing of the glory she had once carried. She was 19, yet the years of trial and captivity had hollowed her cheeks, thinned her frame. Still, her eyes carried that strange light, as if the fire that would soon consume her had already found a home inside. The priests entered her cell, urging her once more to confess her visions false, to declare obedience to the court. Joan shook her head. "All I have done was by God's command. If I had said otherwise, I would have condemned myself." Her voice trembled, not with doubt, but with the weight of finality. She asked only one thing, that she might receive the sacrament. At first they hesitated, fearful of granting holiness to one condemned. But her persistence overcame them, and at last she was given the host. She wept as it touched her tongue, whispering prayers as though speaking directly to the saints who had walked with her since Domremy. They led her through the streets on a cart, guarded by soldiers who flinched beneath the jeers and cheers of the crowd. Some mocked her, calling her witch, heretic, liar. Others wept silently, unable to reconcile the girl they had seen raise armies with the prisoner bound before them. Joan's lips never ceased moving, her prayers rising above the noise. She looked neither to the crowd nor to the soldiers, but lifted her gaze toward the sky. At the marketplace, the stake stood waiting, piled high with kindling. The executioner shifted uneasily. This was no common task. Judges and bishops sat in view, cloaked in authority, ready to witness what they had decreed. The English lords watched too, eager for the flame to erase their shame at Orleans. They read her sentence aloud, condemning her as a relapsed heretic, one who had spurned the Church's mercy. The words were heavy, droning, but Joan stood calm. When they asked her final words, she cried out, "Yes, my voices were from God. They have not deceived me." The crowd stirred, some gasping, some scoffing. She was tied to the stake, her body bound with ropes, the wood piled around her feet. She asked for a cross. A soldier, moved despite himself, fashioned one hastily from 2 sticks and placed it in her hands. Another brought the processional cross from a church, holding it high before her so she might see it. Joan fixed her gaze upon it, her voice rising above the murmurs of the crowd. Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. The torch was lowered. The flames licked the wood, then roared upward, smoke billowing, fire crackling. The crowd hushed, thousands watching as the girl in white flame called out to heaven. Her cries grew louder, not of pain, but of prayer. Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, Saint Margaret, stand with me. The fire rose higher, engulfing her. Still she called the name of Christ, her voice piercing even the roar of the blaze. Some in the crowd wept openly, others turned away, unable to watch. The executioner himself trembled, later swearing he had seen a dove rise from the smoke. When at last the fire consumed her, silence fell heavy. The crowd, so eager for spectacle, stood stunned. For Joan had not died with curses or cries of despair. She had died with the name of Jesus on her lips, her gaze fixed on heaven. And in that moment they knew they had not destroyed her. They had only made her eternal. When the flames had burned down, all that remained was ash and bone, a blackened stake standing amid smouldering wood. The crowd lingered, murmuring, unsettled. The judges departed quickly, their robes fluttering, their faces pale. The English lords turned away, though their triumph felt hollow. The people of Rouen whispered among themselves, some swearing they had seen holiness in her face as the fire rose. The executioners gathered what remained. Her body, charred and broken, still bore traces of shape, too human, too recognizable. The English feared relics, feared that people would carry away even a fragment, a finger, a lock of hair, claiming miracles. They feared the girl would rise even in death, not in flesh, but in legend. And so they burned her again. A second fire was lit, hotter, fiercer, consuming what little remained. The bones cracked, the ashes scattered. Still, fragments endured, and the executioners burned her a third time until all was dust, all indistinguishable from the blackened wood. When nothing but ash remained, they gathered it carefully, fearful of even the memory becoming relic. They carried it to the Seine, the river that wound through Rouen, and scattered it into the water. The ashes drifted on the current, sinking slowly, carried away beyond reach. The English watched, satisfied. No shrine could rise, no relics be kept. The maid would vanish, forgotten, her body swallowed by the river. But rivers do not bury memory, they carry it. The Seine flowed on, bearing her ashes into the wide waters, carrying whispers to villages downstream, to towns that remembered her banner, to fields where soldiers still spoke her name. The English had sought to erase her, but in scattering her ashes, they had scattered her legend. In Rouen, silence lingered. The square where she had burned remained heavy, the smoke seeming to cling long after the fire had died. Those who had mocked her now felt unease. Those who had wept carried her memory in secret. Even the executioner confessed to priests, haunted by what he had seen, by the certainty that he had not killed a heretic, but a saint. In France, the news spread quickly. The people mourned, but their mourning carried fire. They did not forget Orléans, they did not forget Reims, and they would not forget Rouen. Joan had crowned a king and freed a city. Now, in death, she had become something greater. Not merely a soldier, not merely a girl, but a martyr. And martyrs are not erased by rivers. They rise in the current, carried into every heart that remembers. After her death, silence did not last. Whispers spread, then stories, then songs. Soldiers who had fought under her banner told their children of her courage. Priests who had condemned her in Rouen now spoke uneasily of what they had witnessed. Common folk who had once touched her standard in faith told tales of miracles, of light around her face, of the certainty that she had been chosen by God. The English had sought to destroy her, but they had only sharpened her image. Her ashes had become her legacy, scattered yet indestructible. The very act of burning her had lifted her from soldier to saint in the hearts of the people. In the years that followed, France rallied, the tide of war turned, the English lost ground, the crown of France grew secure. And though Charles remained cautious, though he had failed to save her, the crown upon his head bore her mark. Without her, there would have been no Reims, no coronation, no king. Decades later, the church itself would reopen her case. Testimonies were gathered, records examined, voices raised. Those who had condemned her were judged false, their trial a stain upon the name of justice. Joan was declared innocent, her death a murder, her mission vindicated. Centuries passed, but her story did not fade. She became the Maid of Orleans, the warrior saint, the girl who had heard voices and obeyed them without fear. Painters carved her in armour, poets sang of her, soldiers invoked her name before battle. Her memory lit fires in the hearts of all who believed that faith could move nations. At last, the church itself canonized her, declaring her saint, her name lifted to the altars she had once prayed before. Bells rang across France, not for a king, but for the girl who had crowned one. Joan of Arc, once a peasant, once a prisoner, once ash upon a river, became immortal. Her life, her death, her faith, all carried forward not by relics but by memory. She remained the voice of courage, the proof that obedience to God can change history, the reminder that even betrayal and fire cannot silence truth. And so she endures, not in Rouen ashes, not in the Seine's current, but in the heart of every soul who dares to believe that one voice, one faith, one flame can alter the fate of kingdoms. Though the fire at Rouen had consumed her body, it did not silence her. The square that had once been filled with jeers now sat heavy with unease. People avoided it after dark, saying they could still hear her voice crying the name of Christ. Soldiers who had guarded her whispered that their dreams were restless, haunted by her gaze, by the steady calm in her eyes, even as the flames rose. The English declared victory, yet their victory tasted of ash. Rouen was a city in chains, but the chain rattled with guilt. Priests who had watched her execution found themselves unable to preach as before. The bishop who had presided over her trial, Cauchon, was uneasy in triumph. His sermons grew harsher, his face drawn with the weariness of a man who fears his own judgment more than that of others. For he had condemned a girl who had crowned a king, and in her death he felt not vindication but shadow. Among the people, whispers began. They spoke of the white dove seen rising in the smoke, of the cross that glowed through the fire, of the way her last word had been Jesus. Some said the flames themselves had recoiled, burning strangely, bending away from her face. Others swore her body had remained incorrupt until the third burning. These stories grew, not from the mouths of the powerful, but from the lips of ordinary men and women who had stood in the square. And stories, once loosed, cannot be chained. The English tried to silence them. They forbade talk of the maid, punished those who spoke of miracles. Yet the more they forbade, the more the stories spread. For silence is fertile soil, and in it truth grows stronger. France, too, stirred with memory. Letters carried news of her death across the land. Villages wept, towns cursed the English, soldiers swore revenge. In cathedrals, priests hesitated when naming her heretic, their voices faltering as though afraid the word itself might burn their tongues. For though she had been condemned, she had not been broken. In the silence after Rouen, Joan's presence grew larger, not smaller. She had been a soldier, then a captive, then a prisoner of the church. Now she was something greater, a martyr whose memory haunted those who killed her and uplifted those she had once led. Rouen was filled with shadows, but within them her light began to burn brighter. Time moved forward, as it always does. Wars continued, alliances shifted, kings schemed. Yet in France, one memory refused to fade. The people remembered the maid. They remembered the banner, the armour, the voice that had promised God's help. They remembered Orléans, where a city had been saved. They remembered Reims, where a king had been crowned. And they remembered Rouen, where fire had tried and failed to erase her. In villages, peasants told stories of her courage to their children, who repeated them to theirs. Soldiers carried her memory into battle, whispering her name before charges, believing she still rode beside them. Women spoke of her purity, her strength, her defiance against the order that tried to silence her. Men who had once mocked her now swore she had been holy all along. The church, uneasy, tried to control the narrative. They insisted she had been rightly judged, that she had been deceived by false visions. But the people did not believe. They trusted what they had seen with their own eyes, the victories, the miracles, the transformation of a broken nation into one that believed again. Charles, the king she had crowned, lived on in comfort, yet he could not entirely escape her shadow. Though he seldom spoke of her, the crown upon his head was heavy with her memory. Some whispered that he feared her ghost, that he prayed in secret for forgiveness for failing to save her. Others said he resented her, for the people loved her more than they loved him. Decades passed, and still her story spread. Pilgrims came to Rouen, kneeling in the square where she had burned. They took handfuls of earth, whispering prayers, as though the ashes of her martyrdom still lingered in the soil. Songs were sung, poems written, paintings made. Joan had become more than a girl, more than a soldier, more even than a martyr. She had become the soul of France. France remembered her not because the church told them to, but because they could not forget. For in her they had seen what faith could do: lift a king, free a city, defy the strongest armies. And in her death they had seen what betrayal could do: silence a voice, only to make it echo louder through the centuries. Nearly 25 years after her death, the fire at Rouen was lit again, not with wood, but with words. Pope Calixtus III ordered a retrial, not to condemn, but to judge anew. The people had demanded it. Her family had begged for it. And France, still healing, needed it. The king himself, whose crown had been born of her hand, could no longer ignore the stain her trial had left. The retrial summoned witnesses from across the land: priests, soldiers, villagers. Even some who had once stood against her were called to testify. The halls filled not with chains, but with voices, each bearing memory of the maid. They spoke of her piety, her purity, her courage. They told of the sieges lifted, the soldiers inspired, the faith renewed. They told of her prayers, her visions, her refusal to waver even under chains. They told of the injustice of her trial, the corruption of judges who served not God but England. One by one, their words painted a portrait not of heresy but of sanctity. Her family came forward too. Her mother, now aged, wept as she spoke of her daughter's innocence, her faith, her love for God. Her brothers recounted her visions, her vow, her steadfastness. Their grief, still raw after decades, moved the court to silence. The records of Rouen were examined, the questions twisted to trap her, the denials of her sacrament, the false promises of mercy. It became clear to all. Her trial had not been justice, but execution disguised as law. At last, the verdict was given. Joan of Arc was declared innocent, her trial null, her condemnation unjust. The Church, which had once branded her heretic, now proclaimed her faithful. The fire that had consumed her was declared the fire of martyrdom, not of sin. The people rejoiced. Bells rang across France, this time not for kings or treaties, but for the girl who had crowned a king and died for her obedience. In that moment, Joan was restored, not only to her family, not only to France, but to history. She had lived as a peasant, fought as a soldier, died as a prisoner, and risen as a martyr. Now she was vindicated, her name cleansed, her legacy secure. And though centuries would pass before the Church named her saint, she had already become holy in the hearts of the people. The retrial did not erase the flames of Rouen. It could not give back the years she had lost, the crown she had secured for an unworthy king, the life stolen in youth, but it gave her justice, and justice, though delayed, burns brighter than fire. Thus the Maid of Orleans, betrayed by the Church in life, was redeemed by the Church in death, and her voice, silenced once by flame, spoke again clear, eternal, unbroken. The fire at Rouen had long gone cold, but its embers smouldered in memory. As years turned into decades, and decades into centuries, Joan's name did not fade. Instead, it deepened, taking root in the soil of France, sprouting in song, prayer, and tale. The peasants who had once watched her rise from their ranks carried her story with them, telling it by hearth and field. Children grew up not knowing her face, but knowing her courage, and in their games they raised sticks like banners, shouting her name as if she still rode beside them. France itself changed. The 100 Years' War ended, the English driven out. Kings rose and fell, dynasties shifted, revolutions brewed. Yet through it all, Joan remained. She was not tied to a single reign or a single city. She belonged to the people, and they carried her as a torch through dark times. When wars raged again, soldiers invoked her name, calling her their sister in arms. When famine struck, mothers spoke of her purity to daughters, telling them they too could be strong, faithful, unyielding. When priests preached, they mentioned her martyrdom, the young woman who had defied armies and endured the fire without breaking faith. Her memory was not always the same. To some she was warrior, clad in armour, fierce and unrelenting. To others she was saintly virgin, a soul untouched by corruption. To yet others she was a symbol of France itself, betrayed, wounded, but never destroyed. The centuries polished her image, shifting it like light through stained glass, yet always leaving her radiant. The Church, once her accuser, now honoured her in liturgy and prayer. Local feasts sprang up, unofficial but fervent, where candles were lit and bells tolled in her name. In villages, makeshift shrines appeared, adorned with flowers and crude carvings. Pilgrims walked to Domremy, to Orleans, to Rouen, seeking to touch the soil where she had walked, fought, or died. The English, too, could not escape her ghost. For even in their chronicles, grudging respect seeped through. They had called her witch and heretic, yet they knew she had turned the tide of a war their kings had long claimed. They had killed her body, but they had given birth to a legend that shadowed them for generations. And so, through the shifting centuries, Joan's voice echoed. Not through parchment or relics, those had been burned, scattered, but through memory itself, carried in hearts, in whispers, in songs. She became more than a figure of the past. She became a mirror in which each age saw its struggles, and in which each soul saw the strength to endure. By the time the world entered the storms of modernity, Joan's name was no longer only a memory. It was a banner raised high in the winds of nations. France, fractured by revolutions and wars, found in her a symbol beyond kings and republics. She was neither noble nor partisan. She was the peasant girl who had lifted a crown, the martyr who had been burned unjustly. She belonged not to thrones but to the people, and so every France monarchy, empire, or republic claimed her as its own. In Orleans, her feast became tradition. Each year, the city commemorated the maid who had freed them, filling streets with processions, banners waving, bells tolling. Her statue was raised in bronze and stone, her figure carved into cathedrals, her image painted upon canvases. Artists saw in her both strength and sorrow, a warrior with eyes lifted heavenward, a girl weeping in chains, a martyr haloed in flame. Each brushstroke renewed her story, carried it into parlours and galleries, giving her face to generations who had never known it. Politicians invoked her too. In times of division, they spoke her name to rally unity. In times of war, generals told soldiers to fight as Joan had fought, fearless, faithful, unbroken. Revolutionaries admired her defiance of power. Monarchists admired her loyalty to the crown. The paradox only strengthened her, for each side saw truth in her, and each carried her banner for their cause. The people of France needed her most in times of despair. During the long wars of the 19th century, when invasions threatened, when Paris starved, her memory was summoned again. They painted her on posters, prayed to her in trenches, marched with her image held aloft. She was no longer just a girl of Domremy, but a national mother, a guardian spirit, the living flame of France. Beyond France, her story crossed borders. In England, she became the reminder of guilt, yet also of courage. In Italy, in Germany, in lands far beyond, she was known as the girl who had heard voices and defied empires. Writers wrote plays, poets sang verses, dramatists staged her trial and her death. She was tragedy and triumph woven together. Her banner stretched further still, into the minds of ordinary people. Farmers whispered her story in fields. Workers carried her image in pockets. Children studied her in schools. Each found in her a piece of themselves, the dreamer, the fighter, the believer. The banner of nations is often stained with blood, but Joan's was stained with fire, fire that destroyed her body, but lit her legend. And so, across nations and centuries, she marched still, the Maid of Orleans, carrying not only France, but the hope of all who longed for justice born of faith. As centuries passed, her name grew not only in the mouths of the people, but in the chambers of the church. The retrial had declared her innocent, but vindication was not yet sainthood. That title, reserved for the few, demanded centuries of witness, of miracles, of devotion proven through time. And Joan's devotion never waned. It grew. Petitions rose to Rome from bishops, priests, layfolk. They asked that Joan be honoured not only as martyr of France, but as saint of the Church. At first, the papal halls were cautious. The memory of her trial still lingered like smoke, a reminder of a shameful past. Yet, as centuries turned, the voices became louder, the devotion undeniable. In the 19th century, as France reeled from revolution and empire, Joan's cause gained new fire. Orléans renewed their feasts with fervour, Domremy became pilgrimage ground, and statues rose in Paris, Reims, and beyond. Writers like Michelet and poets like Schiller cast her in immortal light, stirring the hearts of Europe. She was no longer simply history, she was destiny. The Church could not ignore her. Investigations began, testimonies collected, miracles examined. Reports spoke of healings at her shrines, of prayers answered through her intercession. The faithful claimed visions, dreams, signs. Joan, who had once been condemned by bishops, was now defended by them. At last, in 1909, Pope Pius X beatified her, declaring her among the blessed. Bells rang across France. Pilgrims flooded Orléans, carrying banners, lighting candles, singing hymns. The girl who had died, branded heretic, was now lifted as holy. But her journey did not end there. The world, torn by wars greater than any she had fought, looked to her again. In the trenches of the Great War, soldiers prayed to her, calling her their comrade. French regiments marched with her image, believing she watched from heaven as she once had led on earth. And in 1920, after the smoke of that war had cleared, Pope Benedict XV canonized her. Joan of Arc was saint. The bells of cathedrals tolled across the world. From Domremy to Paris, from Rome to distant lands, her name was spoken in reverence. Churches were dedicated in her honour, prayers written to her, feast days fixed in the calendar. She stood not only as the Maid of Orléans, not only as the martyr of Rouen, but as Saint Joan, patron of France, guardian of courage, defender of the faithful. The church that once condemned her now exalted her. The crown that had abandoned her now enshrined her. The people who had wept at her burning now sang her name in liturgy. Towards sainthood she had walked not in peace but in fire, not in ease but in chains, and it was through fire and chains that she became what no trial could destroy, immortal, holy, eternal. When the guns of the Great War thundered across Europe, the memory of Joan rose from history into immediacy. France bled once more, her fields torn by shells, her sons buried in trenches. The enemy pressed from the east, and the nation, weary from centuries of struggle, found itself staring into the abyss again. In that abyss, the people remembered the maid. Her image appeared in the dugouts, tacked to the walls of muddy trenches. Soldiers carried small cards with her likeness. A girl in armour, with eyes lifted to heaven. They whispered her name before going over the top, believing she stood with them in the smoke. Her story was told again and again, how she had lifted a siege, crowned a king, and endured fire without breaking. In the mud of Flanders and the ruins of Verdun, the tale was not just history, but prayer. Priests walked among the men, speaking of her as sister, comrade, and saint. They said she knew what it was to face overwhelming force, to hold courage when fear gnawed the heart. They told them she too had been young, no older than many of them, and had gone willingly into battle for France. In her they found not a distant figure of medieval legend, but someone near, someone who understood the terror of standing against armies. The generals invoked her as well. Posters bore her image, urging men to fight as she had fought. Propaganda painted her as France itself betrayed once, but never again. To fight for France was to fight with Joan. The maid became more than saint. She became weapon of morale, a rallying cry that united soldier and civilian alike. Yet beyond the slogans, there was something deeper. In the stillness between bombardments, in the nights when the horizon burned and the earth shook, men knelt in the mud and called upon her. They asked her to intercede, to protect them, to bring them home. And when shells fell, when comrades died beside them, they swore they saw her face, faint in the smoke, urging them onward. Women at home prayed to her too. Mothers lit candles, wives whispered her name as they waited for letters. They saw in her not only the saint of battle, but the daughter of a village, the girl who had known hardship, who had been taken from her family by war. In her, they saw their own daughters, their own sons, and they found comfort that she watched from heaven. The war ended, but Joan's presence did not fade. She had walked with France through fire once more, not as soldier, but as saint. And when peace came, though scarred and fragile, it carried her name as part of its survival. For the men who returned carried her memory with them, and the dead who lay in fields lay beneath her silent protection. The saint of the trenches had stood with France again, proving that martyrdom does not end a life, it multiplies it across generations.